right, thanks. No, I have this one. All right, good morning, everyone. That's the enthusiasm I was looking for. Thank you very much. Very good to be here. We will be sharing some of the things we've learned over the past 7 years almost, traveling around the world to visit some of the world's most progressive organizations. I will share a little bit of background on CorporateRebels first, and then dive into some of the examples of organizations that are radically reinventing the way they work. But before I'm going to do that, I'm going to put you to the test a little bit. And this is going to be a challenging test with the chairs where they fold back up. But we're going to try it anyway. I'm going to put out some statements. If you agree with this statement, stand up. If you disagree, you can just remain seated. First one. In your company, the majority of employees are highly engaged, highly motivated. If you agree, stand up. If you disagree, you can remain seated. Okay. Okay, thank you. Very clear. You will see by the statistics that I'll share later that quite a few of you have been lying to me already. Second one, in your organization, every employee is allowed to work wherever and whenever they want. Okay? Okay, the group becomes quite a bit smaller already. Statement number 3. In your organization, teams select their own leaders. Okay? Probably freelancers, yeah. Well, we can learn directly now if that's the case. In your organization, employees can set their own salary. Those are the freelancers. Okay. Thanks for that. Gives an interesting insight into your organizations. And believe it or not, we've come across companies over the past couple of years putting some of these radical practices in place. I'm not saying that all of you should be doing that starting tomorrow, but definitely an eye-opener in what can be done in progressive organizations across the globe to figure out ways to motivate their employees to the highest possible extent. I'm going to share a couple of those stories today, and hopefully inspire you with some of the things we've learned over the past couple of years. But before, a little bit of background on CorporateRebels, because we started the company 7 years ago. And back then it wasn't a company at all. We had no business model. We only had one conviction, that we wanted to make work more fun. And the reason why we wanted to make work more fun was a bit self-centered, because we had very frustrating work experiences before. So Joost studied, where are you? Oh, there. Nanotechnology. And he was doing some really nerdy work in a laboratory in Barcelona for a big German company. I was also doing quite nerdy work, being an industrial engineer, and I started to work for a company that made baggage handling systems for airports. And we were doing exactly the thing we had studied for. And we enjoyed the content of the work a lot. But after a period of 3 years, we became totally frustrated with the way things were organized. The fact that there was a boss telling you what to do, there was no freedom to decide for yourself where and when you worked. The fact that there was no opportunity to be entrepreneurial or be innovative, because every new idea you had would be immediately killed, and they would simply say, well, that's simply not the way we do things around here. So pretty frustrating experiences, probably familiar to what you have seen in your career as well, because many organizations still function like this. So we wanted to solve the issue for ourselves, but also for more people around the world. Because when we started looking into the research being done on engagement and motivation in workplaces, we learned that, if this one works, we learned that the way we currently work in many organizations is painfully broken. If you, for example, look at engagement in the workplace, a big research study done by Gallup. I think we're a bit low on battery here. Stick to this side of the podium. Research done by Gallup, and they asked hundreds of thousands of respondents across the globe a couple of simple questions to figure out whether they are engaged, disengaged, or highly disengaged. Actively disengaged. 15% of the world's population is engaged at work. Just 15%. So those are the people truly motivated about their work and their work environment. 67% is disengaged, so they come into the office, do what they're being told, but are not truly passionate about their work. And 18%, quite a painful number, bigger than the group of engaged employees, is actively disengaged. Meaning they sabotage the workplace because they simply don't like to be there and don't like to do that work. For example, calling in sick while they are not, avoiding work they should be doing, or throwing it over to other people, spending their time on social media, or complaining at the coffee machine, which is a very popular thing to do in the Netherlands, where we are from. All kinds of things to avoid doing the work you should be doing, simply because you don't like it and you don't like the work environment. If you look at the same time at how people feel inside organizations, you see that there's a huge amount of burnout symptoms in today's workplaces. After the pandemic, that has even increased, where more people are feeling miserable at work or because of their work. 23% always or often experience burnout symptoms, and 44% sometimes have this. So a lot of people are apparently feeling sick at work or because of work. And then the final one, a contribution to society. 40% of the people feel that their job makes no useful contribution to society. That's a painful one, because if you look at one of the main drivers of motivation, one of them is meaning or purpose. And if so many people are not experiencing this, we're missing out on a huge amount of potential, both in terms of motivation, but also in terms of success of a team or an organization. And we set out to solve this, mainly because we believe that if you spend so much time working, this should also be time that you thoroughly enjoy, right? And can use your talents to contribute to something that you truly believe in. But let's say you don't care about that at all. And you don't care about the happiness of employees, which I can't imagine is the case for this crowd, but let's just assume. Let's say you're the CEO of a big company and all you care about is your bottom line. You want to make as much money as possible. Still then, it's beneficial to focus on creating a workplace where people love to be. Simply because the two go hand in hand. On the one hand, if you look at the engagement, and on the other hand, business outcomes, for example, like productivity and profit, they are higher when people are more engaged, more motivated, and absenteeism, accidents, and defects are actually lower when people are more engaged. Makes total sense, but especially if you're a bunch of engineers, it's nice to know that there's also data to back up a gut feeling. But if you look at your private lives, you know this is like this too, right? If you're passionate about something, you'll put more energy into it, you'll have more conviction, more perseverance, and probably the outcome will be better too. So a strong correlation between the two, which is vitally important for people to understand because it has benefits on both sides, both on the individual and on the organization side. So we set out to look for alternative ways of working. And the experience we had was something we wanted to learn how to avoid that. And what kind of ways can you organize work alternatively to what we had experienced ourselves? So we created a bucket list, and we made a list of pioneers across the globe, organizations, academics, CEOs, entrepreneurs, that could teach us something about making work more fun. So some of the usual suspects, which we thought were inspiring workplaces back then, like Google, Spotify, Netflix, more of these like usual suspect from Silicon Valley, or Stockholm, by the way. But we learned over time, when adding more companies and organizations to that list, that we were actually more inspired by the companies that were in totally different sectors, that companies that have been around for ages already, and that had to radically reinvent themselves to figure out a new way to work. So I'm going to share an example of an organization working like that, but first we're going to dive into the 8 trends. So what have we learned from these 150 plus visits over the past couple of years? From what progressive organizations do different than the more traditional ones. And these 150 plus visits have been all across the globe, as you can see, in loads of different sectors, from government to healthcare, to finance, to IT, to manufacturing. big companies, small companies in different sectors, different industries, different regions of the world, to show that radically new ways of working can work in any type of environment. Because most of the time, people tend to think, when we share examples like these, it's great that it works over there, but it will never work in our organization. And then they have a whole bunch of reasons why it would never work. We kind of try to bust those stereotypes and those assumptions and show that it can work in any type of work environment. All right, diving into those 8 trends. There are 8. I'm going to run through them quite quickly, and then I'm going to test with you where you think you are currently on this scale. First one is a move from profit to purpose and values. So these pioneering organizations focus very strongly on putting their purpose first, and not just in their commercials or their annual reports, but actually in their day-to-day decision making. So if they have a tough decision to make, they decide to go for purpose first and profit second. And that's completely different than what the vast majority of organizations are doing, because they tend to focus solely on the bottom line, the financial success, and the increasing the shareholder value every single quarter. It's important that these organizations don't just say this, but they also actually do it. One of the examples that we've been visiting over the past couple of years is Patagonia. You might have heard the story last week. I'm pretty sure everybody almost heard that story last week, that the founder and owner gave away the company to a sort of complex structure, but to make sure that all of the profits of the future would then go to good causes and to charities and grassroots environmental organizations. And Patagonia has shown throughout its lifetime, every time, that they were making decisions based on their purpose, being a sustainable fashion brand, and nowadays even saying that they are there to save the home planet. And they are a very responsible brand, time and time again, putting their decisions or putting their money where their mouth is. So one of the many examples we've come across. Then the second trend is a move from hierarchical pyramids to a network of team structure. And being familiar with agile ways of working, you're probably already more familiar with this structure. But some companies take this way further than just reinventing a specific department, but they reinvent their entire organizational structure, moving away from the traditional pyramid with the CEO on top, lots of management layers in between, and then the front line of people doing most of the operational work. These companies break down the hierarchy from an average of 8 to 9 layers to about 2 or 3 layers, and having a lot of highly autonomous teams in place that have huge amount of decision-making responsibility themselves. And they almost act as if they are separate businesses within the larger network organization. And we'll share an example of a manufacturing company that is working like this very successfully and very radically. A third trend is a move from directive leadership to supportive leadership. So moving away from the idea that bosses are the ones making the decisions, that you have to go up the hierarchy to get approval for certain things, but instead leaders becoming coaches or coordinators or whatever you'd like to call them, but the people who are there to truly support the success of the team and allowing the team itself to make most or almost all of the decisions that they need to make. That's also where you see a lot of organizations adopting self-selected leaders. Simply by allowing the team to select their own representative really creates this culture of supportive leadership that you wouldn't get in an organization where leaders are appointed from the top. Then, the fourth one is from planning and predicting to experimenting and adapting. So moving away from the idea that you can plan and predict what will happen in the future, and instead moving to an environment where you constantly experiment and adapt. I think Agile is all about it, but let me share an example of an organization that is quite a bit different than taking this to a further extreme. Anybody familiar with Handelsbanken? No? Yeah, I see a few hands. Yeah, you're from Sweden, that makes sense then. So a large Swedish bank that is very much organized according to these 8 trends. And if you, for example, look at that experiment and adapt trend, they put that in practice very clearly because it's a large financial institution, so a bank employing 14,000 people, and they do not have an annual budgeting cycle in place. So they did away with that 40 years ago already because they believed it was an outdated way to organize. That they were every year spending 2 months of the year trying to predict the future, then fixing their budgets, to then figure out the year after that it was impossible to predict the future. and then being stuck in those budgets, either making sure they spend everything at the end of the year, so they won't be cut after, or not having the opportunity to attract more funding to actually grasp the opportunities that they see at that moment in time. So, a good example of an organization reinventing such basic practices that we assume are necessary to run an organization. Then, a move from rules and control to freedom and trust. So how can you get rid of lots of rules and policies and procedures that dictate how people should be doing their job? And how can you instead focus on creating a work environment where people have the trust and the freedom to make their own decisions? One personal experience that I always like to share is that as I mentioned, I worked for a company that made baggage handling systems for airports. So I had to travel quite a lot around the world. Then I came back to the headquarters in the Netherlands, and I had to fill in my expense claims. And you might be familiar with these too. Long pages of expense claims I had to fill in to make sure everything was according to the company rules and the company guidelines. It took ages. And then the document was sent to my manager for approval. Then it was sent to his manager for approval. And then she sent it to a separate department that was exclusively set up to check expense claims. So there were people working on a full-time basis to keep this control mechanism in place. So you can imagine the time, the cost, the frustration involved in this childish process. A more progressive organization, like for example Netflix, does away with that, and they believe they only need one guideline in their travel policy, which is act in Netflix's best interest. So use the money as if it were your own. If you have to go to a fancy restaurant to get an important deal, please go ahead and do so. But if you can achieve the same outcome by spending less money, we trust you to make that decision yourself. So do what's in the best interest of the company. Because at home we are allowed to make huge amounts of we have huge amounts of responsibilities, and we make very complex decisions ourselves when it comes to raising our children, organizing things in our community, buying houses, huge responsibilities. But then we come into the office and we're not even allowed to spend 500 euros of company money. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So that's why these companies get rid of those rules and policies. And as a result, distribute much of the authority and decision-making power to people at the front line. So instead of having centralized decision-making powers, you distribute it as far as possible to the front line so that people in close contact with customers and suppliers are the ones who can make decisions quickly. The seventh one is a move from secrecy to radical transparency. So opening up all kinds of information for people to understand how their team, how their business is doing. So opening up the company financials, translating that to team level so teams can properly understand how they are performing. Opening up salary levels so everyone in the company can see what other people are earning. Some companies go pretty far in this and make everything they can transparent by default, unless there's a really good reason why not to do it. For example, privacy reasons. So, and the final one is a move from job descriptions to talents and mastery. So, getting away from the idea that you would have a fixed job description that states a person's day-to-day activities with a fancy job title, and building up the organizational chart as a combination of job descriptions, where if you make a promotion, you move from one job description to the next. These organizations, once again, believe that that's way too rigid, and we should instead focus on finding people's main talents. So every individual's main talents, and figuring out a way to let them constantly develop those talents. So creating much more fluid careers where people can pick up specific roles and thereby combining their own ideal job, instead of having to be fixed on these job descriptions that were designed for them. And we did a big research study in the Netherlands to figure out how present these trends are in the Dutch work environment. And we learned painfully that the last one, talents and mastery, was lacking most. 67% of people said they could not use their main talents in their day-to-day work. 67% of people. So we're missing out on a huge amount of talent, potential, and therefore also motivation. So finding ways to actually bring those talents, but also some of the other trends we talked about, much more to the forefront of the organization, can significantly boost both the engagement and the productivity of the organization. All right, quick question to you now. If you see these 8 trends, where do you feel your team, let's start with your team in the larger organization. So where do you feel your team currently is when you look at these trends? Do you feel you're more on the traditional side? Then you can remain seated. If you feel you're much more on the progressive side, then you can stand up. Go. Okay, so not many people standing up. I would have expected much better outcomes at this Agile conference. But apparently a lot to be done still. Now in terms of your entire organization. So we talked about the team just now. How about your entire organization? Where do you feel you are? Traditional, remain seated. Progressive, stand up. Okay. All right. I think it becomes painfully clear here that there's still quite a lot of work to be done. As we shared in the beginning, frustration can be a pretty powerful motivator for change, right? So let's take 1 minute to discuss with your neighbor your biggest frustration in the current way of working in your organization. 1 minute, go. Ja, maar er zitten ook te veel van die dingen in dat heet het. Toch?
Ja, nou, ik weet wel een beetje dat ik moet weer...
wanneer ik het wil. Ah ja, dat is ook goed.
Ik vind het prima, want dan ga ik wel hier met de klikker zitten, dan doe ik het wel.
Ja, ja.
I will do it from here. Ik weet niet wat system is.
Even kijken, ja, werkt het? Ja, dan ga ik te veel, nee, doe maar niet. Dan ga ik te veel zitten denken aan wanneer je gaat klikken. Probeer wel met schreeuwen. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay. I think we have pretty good sound for when people just shout out their biggest frustration, if you do it one by one. Who wants to share one of the frustrations they discussed? Just shout it out. Let it out. Decision making, not enough qualified people anymore. Centralized authority, yeah. Trust, a lack of trust, I guess. Yeah. Yes, the tough part is getting people from the left to the right in terms of mindset. Well, I can tell you it's also pretty hard in terms of actual practices in organizations, but we're going to focus on both. So thank you very much for that bridge. I'd like to share an example of an organization that has completely reinvented itself from the very traditional side to the very progressive side. What is important with trends like these and talks like these is that you don't start copy-pasting the idea. That it's not a model you should start implementing yourself. These 8 trends aren't. The case study that I'll share is a very inspiring one, but please just take some lessons and ideas and principles from it, put it to the test, and figure out your own ideal way of working. Because there's no such thing as a solution for every single person or every single organization. Anybody familiar with the organization Hire? Okay, not that many. I'm not sure if it's available here in Greece, but Hire is a white goods manufacturer. So they have all kinds of washing machines, refrigerators, nowadays much more than that. But they're the biggest white goods manufacturer in the world. And they come from China, spread across the entire globe now. They, a couple of years ago, acquired General Electric appliances in the US. And they've gone through a radical transformation, of which especially the last 10 years have seen huge changes in how they work. Zhang Rumin, the former CEO of the company who left last year, has been leading that organization for about 40 years through a couple of remarkable transformations. And this last one started about 10 years ago, as I said, because they felt they were running into all kinds of problems with the traditional bureaucratic management model. where you have lots of layers of hierarchy, all of the stuff that we just discussed on the left-hand side, they were experiencing at Hire. And they felt as a result that people weren't taking any ownership. They weren't being entrepreneurial, they weren't engaged, they weren't listening to their customers. So they were experiencing big trouble in the organization. And Zhang Rumin said, well, if we need to change anything about it, we can continue telling people to take more ownership, but that's probably not going to work if we don't change our entire structure to actually give them ownership and try to see them as entrepreneurs instead of employees. So they started to break down the company. They employ 80,000 people. They still do. Before the big transformation, they employed them in the traditional hierarchical pyramid. But they decided to split up that big organization into more than 4,000 micro-enterprises. These micro-enterprises consist mainly of 10 to 15 people that are fully responsible for a specific part of the organization. They have their own P&L. Sometimes they have their own share distribution within the team, and much more things that I'll talk about in more detail later on. So they split up that big organization into lots of smaller ones and really created this network of team structure that we talked about before. Really breaking down the bureaucracy and the hierarchy to give people more freedom to act and behave like entrepreneurs. Nowadays, Hire is quite successful. As I mentioned, 80,000 employees, 4,000 micro-enterprises. Annual revenue has grown with more than 20%, while profit increased over the past 10 years with more than 500%. And maybe even more interesting, their new ventures accumulated more than $2 billion in market value. Their success rate of internal startups is 50%, compared to about 10% if you look at other startup ecosystems. So they're very successful in creating an environment where people can pitch their ideas, get the right support, and bring their products and services to market very quickly. Gather a team around them to really act as a startup within a larger network or ecosystem. And they differ, those micro-enterprises, on 3 crucial elements. They have rights that traditional teams in organizations do not have. One of them is on strategy, where the micro-enterprises themselves can decide the opportunities they want to pursue, which kind of business model to have, and which partnerships to form. And with partnerships, we talk about internal partnerships and external ones. So internal partnerships, because the company was broken down into more than 4,000 micro-enterprises, you don't have the traditional structure in place anymore. That also means that teams have to start contracting work with each other to get work done. For example, in Hire, there's no HR department anymore, but you do have a couple of HR micro-enterprises. These micro-enterprises have to deliver their HR services to other micro-enterprises in the organization. If they don't do that well, other micro-enterprises won't hire them, they won't bring in any money, they have to cut costs or fire people or can even go bankrupt as a micro-enterprise. If they are successful, they bring in more money, can distribute it among the members of the team, or they can hire new people to grow their impact and become bigger. So, a very interesting way of organizing that really created this network of contracting micro-enterprises that is very similar to a lot of smaller companies working together, but of course still being able to leverage the size of the company because everybody's part of the same type of organization. Then, when it comes to people, they have huge amounts of responsibilities too. They are responsible for hiring, firing decisions, even leadership election within the organization, but also distributing roles and responsibilities within the team. And there's no HR department doing that for them. It's up to them to figure out what's the best way to be successful in the work that we try to do. And then, when it comes to rewards, they are responsible for setting the salary levels of everyone in the team. They can also distribute shares and distribute the profits if they are there. So as you can imagine, this is a totally different dynamic than what you see in traditional organizations, in traditional teams. And instead of just telling people to be more entrepreneurial, at Hire, they actually give employees the opportunity to act like entrepreneurs. And they actually feel as if they are running their own businesses within this larger ecosystem called Hire. So a really progressive organization, and I can tell you we've seen loads of them similar to Hire, where you would have this network of team structure with a lot of decision-making authority for the teams themselves. So another very interesting example is a company called Buurtzorg, which is a Dutch home care nursing organization. They employ 15,000 people, and there's not a single manager in the entire organization. So they're distributed into more than 1,000 self-managing teams who take care of everything that needs to happen within their part of the organization, which in their case is home care nursing. So really interesting examples. If you want to learn more, there's more than 600 blog posts on our website of companies reinventing the way they work, similar to what Hire has been doing over the past 10 years. All right, next part, a vital part, and something that you touched upon as well. How the hell do you get there? It's interesting to hear about these 8 trends, to hear about these progressive ways of working, to hear about these case studies, but how can you actually get there as an organization? Pretty annoying answer to that, it depends. But there are some common elements that we are seeing. So if you look at the various approaches that these companies take, there's 4 options to pursue. On the one hand, if you're not that bold, if you feel it's too risky to embark on a radical transformation at once, you can start upgrading the teams one by one. So start fixing the ways of working within your team. We'll talk about some examples of how you can do that later on. But it's not that risky. It allows you to experiment, to figure out what works for your specific teams in the organization. And then, if successful, you can scale it to more teams. Or you can decide to go for a big bang, but only on team level, and start upgrading the way of working of all the teams in the entire organization, more or less at once. If you're even more bold, you can go for an entire progressive organizational setup, but if you want to start relatively small, you can do that in one business unit, one department, one autonomous unit in the organization, that you give the opportunity to completely reinvent its organizational setup, its organizational structure, and all of its practices. Or, for the true rebels out there, a big bang towards a completely new organizational design and organizational setup. And there have been quite a few companies embarking on a transformation like this. And the interesting thing about it is we mostly see that happening, the most radical version, in companies that are really facing some serious trouble. So that are in a big crisis, that have to do things differently, because otherwise they might not survive it. So those are the main reasons that we see these companies, or the main ways we see these companies transforming. And the big question is, what can you do on a team level? Because probably you cannot influence the change of the organizational structure in your organization. In fact, most CEOs cannot even do that. So what can you do within your team or your department to start upgrading the way you work, even more to what you've already done? And we'd like to share, the final thing I'd like to share, 6 topics that we believe have a huge impact on both the engagement in your team and the success of your team. First one, start redesigning your meetings. This is still one of the biggest frustrations in corporates across the globe. First of all, we have way too many meetings. Secondly, we have no clue how to have proper meetings. So we end up spending the vast majority of our time in meetings that are totally unstructured and where it's very unclear what the outcome actually was. So these pioneering organizations have a very fixed working rhythm. One meeting per month, for example, with the team to synchronize on specific topics. And within those meetings, they have a very clear structure on how they do it. And one of the meeting structures we like most, and that we support many organizations with to implement it because it has a huge impact on reducing your meeting time, is one taken from Sociocracy. And the meeting structure roughly goes like this. So first of all, forget what you learn about all of your meeting trainings. And they always tell you to set up an agenda up front and distribute it among everybody who will be in the meeting, right? Don't do that. So start without a clear agenda and build your agenda on the spot. Let everybody who's in that room at that specific moment in time add agenda items and very clearly state what they want to achieve with that. Do they want to make a decision? Do they want to be informed? Or do they want to gather advice so they can make a decision themselves outside of that meeting? They only allow one of these 3 options to very much focus the energy towards a successful outcome. Then they talk in rounds to go through it, ask some clarifying question, round of objections, and then they try to make a decision as quickly as possible. This helps to reduce, well, we have only one internal meeting in our company. It helped to reduce it from 4 hours to around 40 minutes. So pretty big change. We recently worked with a company in Indonesia, and they reduced the amount of meeting time per week on average from 24 to 6. So a huge amount of time became available for people to actually focus on doing work instead of spending their time in useless meetings. Distributing decision-making power, we talked about it already, but avoid consensus decision-making, avoid hierarchical decision-making, instead use consent-based decision-making, where you give a person the opportunity to make a decision very quickly on their own topic and only require from them to ask advice from other people who have expertise or experience on that specific topic. Give better feedback, forget about the mid-year reviews, forget about the annual appraisal forms that you have to go through. Simply have a discussion every month, every 2 months, with individuals in the team on what you can stop, start, and continue doing to improve. Very simple conversations, no need for any bureaucratic exercises. Simply have a conversation, get used to talking with each other about the stop, start, and continues. The final 3, distributing work into roles and responsibilities. We talked about this before as well. Very simple way to do it. First of all, create a list of all the activities you need to do as a team to be successful. Cluster those activities into specific roles and let then people pick up the roles they would love to pick up, only based on intrinsic motivation, not on what's in their job description. And constantly rotate those roles based on changing desires and changing talents in your team. Let people in teams resolve conflicts themselves, create a clear process that can help them to solve conflicts easily without needing a manager to interfere as a sort of referee. And implement result-based working. Still a big problem in many organizations across the globe. We still tend to focus a lot on how many time people spend at work, even though we're not all physically in the office anymore. But when the pandemic hit, everybody moved from an office environment to an online environment. We didn't change anything else except the location. We didn't change the way we were making decisions, the way we were running meetings, how we were communicating with one another. Also not how we were assessing performance. And now all of a sudden, companies are struggling with how do we actually assess if people or teams are successful. So find a way to assess those, or your team or individuals on outcomes and not on where or when they work. Because in the end, you don't hire people to work an X amount of hours from a specific location, but you pay people to actually get successful work done in your organization. So we've seen that if you start with some of these practices in your own teams, this will significantly help boost both the engagement and the productivity in your team. And we've even seen companies transforming. In the Netherlands, there's a really beautiful example of a company called bol.com, which is a sort of Dutch version of Amazon. So an online retailer where a logistics team of 20 people started working on these elements, just with those 20 people at first. But then when they had some initial success, they started to communicate about it in their organization. And other teams picked up the phone, called them and said, can we learn that too? Can you help us to implement similar practices in our team? And over a period of 3 years' time, more than 70% of the company adopted their working practices. And now, of course, they are able to change much bigger things like organizational structure, etc., that they weren't able to influence before. So that's a true revolution happening inside one of those organizations where a change movement has been built, starting from just a team of 20 people. So that's then also our main advice that I want to conclude with. We want you guys to be rebels inside your organization too. If we want to do something about those terrible statistics I shared at the beginning, the lack of engagement, the people feeling burned out or feeling useless in the workplace, if we want to change that into a more positive work environment where more people truly enjoy the work they do, you and many more people in organizations need to stand up to traditional working practices. And we need to start changing that, setting up experiments to figure out a way to improve the way we work. And I think we're in a good community to all pick these things up together and start pushing for more progressive ways of working, also here in lots of organizations within Greece. At Corporate Rebels, as I mentioned, we started in 2016. It was a pretty terrible situation back then. Joost and me, we didn't have any money, we didn't have any business model, we just had this goal of making work more fun. Because we didn't have that much money, we moved into one apartment, but it got even worse. We moved into one bedroom, where we put 2 beds in to make sure that we could cover the cost of travel at the beginning of our journey. Luckily, that has grown a bit. We don't sleep in the same bedroom anymore. That's a very nice upgrade that we've had over the years. Corporate Rebels also has grown a bit in terms of our reach across the globe. In 2016 we started. In 2017 we started organizing meetups across the globe of people coming together to talk about these topics, start implementing changes in their organizations. After that, we published our book that you might have read. It's not available in Greek yet, but it is available in 8 other languages now. We published a Chinese version this week, so I hope to also cover some ground over there. Then the pandemic hit. That completely changed the entire conversation about progressive ways of working. Because before the pandemic, almost all companies said, remote work, it's great that it works over there, those pioneering companies, but it will never work in our organization. Pandemic hit, and everybody after a couple of weeks realized, actually we can do that. So maybe there's even more possible than just changing the physical working location. And now more organizations are open to new ways of working to figure out, can we improve even more than just creating a bit of flexibility around where people work. So that helped us also to scale things bigger. We now have an online learning platform for all kinds of change makers like yourselves who are getting together to learn from these pioneering organizations directly. And besides sharing the content over there of how these pioneering companies work and the specific practices, we also bring together as much people as possible from across the globe to connect with each other and support each other on their journey towards better workplaces. And then last year we launched it, and it's growing now. I think it's our most ambitious project so far, Chrysos. It is a private equity company where we buy and transform small and medium-sized businesses to support them from traditional to a more progressive way of working. And then selling the company to the employees once it has been transformed, so it then cannot go back anymore to this traditional style of management. So hopefully we'll also be able to scale that more. The activities of what we do at Corporate Rebels always change, but the goal is always the same, making work more fun. Hopefully we've been able to give you a very small glimpse into what we've learned over the past couple of years. Once again, our message, become a rebel, join us in the fight for better workplaces, and start pushing for more changes within your organizations. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you, Joost. Fantastic. I noticed there's no pin on the map for Greece. Maybe we need to talk about
if you have any pioneering organizations here that we must visit to research, please let us know.
We have a few. I'm looking at one right now. Thank you very much. Do we have time for questions? Yanis, do you want? No? Okay. Well, thank you again. And let's move along then with our program. Joost and Pim, thank you so much. Tell me. Έχουμε? Oh, we have some time for break. Okay, we have a 10-minute break, so we do have time, perhaps, for the break. All right. So we'll see you back here in 10 minutes. Okay? And go stretch your legs.